Welcome to the Engage and Empower podcast. Behind every successful company is an intentional and innovative approach to empowering your most valuable asset, your people. Join me in having conversations with people and talent leaders as we share our journeys and unpack what it takes to build strong, cohesive teams and employee experiences. From executives at early-stage startups to innovators at large public companies, we'll capture the compelling stories of the people behind people teams. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to the Engage and Empower podcast. I'm your host, Rasika Rajagopalan, and today I could not be more thrilled for my conversation with Aubrey Blanche. Aubrey, I feel like you barely need an intro, but I'll go ahead and do one anyway. Aubrey is currently the Director of Equitable Design, Product, and People at CultureAmp, a product that I think most people tuning in know and love. Aubrey is also the founder of the Math Path, which is an organization she started to combine her empathetic and intersectional approach with social scientific methods to create meaningful, sustainable change and to help organizations think holistically about evolving to meet the needs of a rapidly diversifying and globalizing world. So, Aubrey, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel really lucky to be here. I'm so lucky to be able to get up every day. And while certainly work is still work, I'm just such a lucky human being to get to work on problems that really inspire me and work with so many people who inspire me. And so it's absolutely wonderful to be here.
Oh, we're excited to have you. And I love hearing that. I mean, part of our roles is to help people kind of find their meaning and what they love to do. And so it's always great to be chatting with other diversity and people leaders that, are enjoying their journey themselves. And so I've been eagerly awaiting this conversation and excited to dive right in, starting a little bit with your backstory. You started in academia and then made the shift into tech as you pursued this work. So would love to learn more about what compelled you to focus on this work and why tech. What about this industry compelled you to make the shift? And what do you think makes it different than other industries when it comes to diversity, equity, and belonging?
Yeah, so I think the move from academia to tech was less artful than it looks. So really, I was working on my PhD and I realized that I just ran into institutional barriers that made it really clear that I am white passing for folks who can't see me, but are but I am, Latina and things like that. And so I didn't perceive that I could be successful in academia. I hit the standard sort of racism, sexism tropes, and I was in the Bay Area already. So I was looking for a job and tech was there. And I started in tech as a business development writer, sort of writing marketing documents. And it was during my first tech job that I realized how unbelievably unbalanced the tech world was. But I am most definitely a math nerd and a systems person. And so I was really lucky to get the opportunity to work on I basically proposed a couple of pilot studies inside my company. And I basically said, your recruiting process is broken and you're rejecting really amazing underrepresented people. Although I think I just said women and brown people at the time because this was 2014. And they said, no, we're not. We are a meritocracy. And I said, that's bullshit. And I said, can I run studies to prove it? And actually, to give credit to that HR director, they were like, yes, because if there is a problem, we want to solve it. And so my studies showed that on one team, there wasn't an issue, but in the larger pipelines, I found the same thing that we would expect anywhere, which is that certain parts of lack of process were creating inequity. And from there, I moved into a formal D&I role, and then I got my role at Atlassian. So I was at Atlassian for almost 5 years, leading their diversity and belonging efforts. And so I feel like I grew up at Atlassian in a lot of ways, and it really shaped my theory of change, right? Atlassian is very much an agile shop. And so I thought, why can't you do, what would happen if you took an agile mindset to social justice and organizational transformation, which I guess is not the question everybody asks, but to me was really compelling. And the answer for me was equitable design. So taking design thinking and doing it in a progressive way that's grounded in sort of core principles of social justice, that is the method for transforming organizations from what they say they are to what they actually can be.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what drives that long-term impact. I love your story because I think it captures everything that I love about tech, which is that entrepreneurial spirit and that opportunity that a lot of people have to, identify a need and kind of drive it. And, your entire journey started with exactly that. Obviously, we've made, some progress over the last few years, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And you recently published an article around tech focusing on the wrong metrics when reflecting on whether we're making progress when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so what's the distinction that you're raising between where we are and where we need to be? And to that end, like, when is an organization ultimately diverse? And how do you encourage organizations to think about what that bar or threshold or line is, or even if that concept exists?
Yeah. So I'll start from the last question and work backwards. So I think, when is a person enlightened? When is a person done with their growth? And the answer is there isn't that. And so when is a company X, Y, or Z? I don't know. The nerd brain in me would say it's an asymptotic idea. And for people who don't know what that means, if you've seen Mean Girls, right, the limit does not exist. It's that same concept, right? Anyway, I like to explain math with Mean Girls, which probably gives you a little bit of my general style. But I think it's the reason that I say focus on equitable design, not D&I, because D&I is an outcome and equitable design is a process. And we really create and change the world by thinking about there is a constant process of increasing the equity of a system, of your life, of your interactions. And so that's really what it comes down to. And then to answer your question, you sort of asked what's special about tech. I think in tech, you're right. There is an entrepreneurial spirit that doesn't always exist in other industries. But I also think tech holds itself out as this industry that's, quote, changing the world. And like, I'm sorry, another pizza delivery app is not changing the world in the way that your marketing team is saying that it is. And quite frankly, tech isn't changing the world in the ways that I find most important and salient, which is the technology industry, and for the is the single largest like wealth transfer project in at least American society. And except the thing is, what we know is that underrepresented, historically marginalized people are largely being left out of that. And so I think that it's so critically important to do the work in this industry, because otherwise we're looking at this generation's redlining.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think in the scope of influence that a lot of tech companies have, there is a need and a responsibility for companies to really drive this work, take it more seriously. Innovation in this industry, I mean, companies move faster than our government does. And so I think there's a huge opportunity there in us building a lot more of those equitably designed systems, as you've shared. And I think those systems are what enable those folks that you bring in to be more successful and to grow into high impact roles and actually affect, who they're able to bring into the organization, change the trajectory of the organization. And so I think that there are lots of opportunities and a lot of work to be done. The conversation's definitely getting started, but I think specifically to your point around that equitable design, there are a lot of opportunities there. Part of what you've talked a lot about is this idea of belonging. I've heard you share the concept of belonging on other podcasts, and largely, like, we're in an interesting place right now because a lot of us are working remotely. More companies are transitioning to fully remote and fully distributed structures. And so how do you encourage companies to think about this moving forward? Because largely workplace design does contribute to this concept of belonging. People scan for hints of whether they belong, whether they're gender neutral bathrooms, maybe mother's rooms, maybe yoga spaces. And so how do you build for those cues in a distributed environment?
Yeah, so I think that's such a great question, and it's something we're all tackling. I think part of it comes down to more of the work is on the individuals to create the space where their teammates can belong. So we know that belonging is something that one feels as a function of what other people are doing. And so one little way, and this sounds like such a silly little tip, but I promise that it makes a difference, is, in a remote world, we need to book off the first 5 minutes or so of the meeting just for social connection time, because we're not getting that in like the informal way. We're in an office. That you need to invest more in building relationships and having meetings that are not just about doing work. And for us, our employee resource groups have been really important at CultureAmp for that, because they provide community. And so sometimes especially in a remote world, even though our ERGs also do things like focusing on professional development, say, for their members, like we just had Camp Out, which is our LGBTQIA ERG. They just had a mixer where we have 4 office locations, and 2 offices paired up with each other to have a mixer to meet people from across the organization. And it wasn't fancy, it wasn't a big deal, but it helped like queer campers connect with other queer campers, so they show that they're not alone, even if maybe they're not working with another queer camper every single day in the course of their job.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, both around the building connections piece, which is so important, and then also for those that may be introverted, I think having the time and space for those 5 minutes or even restructuring meetings to be more open and brainstormy and just kind of dialogue-y versus the tactical, all right, what is everyone working on? And, are we all on the right track and the same page? That's when the work can get very transactional and you can start to feel like, what's the bigger purpose here? Like, am I growing my career here? Am I doing impactful work or am I another cog in the machine? So I love that idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's just really human. But again, I think it really points back to the amount of work that a company has to put into enabling people to create belonging for their colleagues goes way up in a remote environment. Because there's a lot of things that aren't belonging specific, but create space for that. So things like teaching people remote best practices so that they have more capacity. One thing at CultureAmp that my team and I have worked on is asking the question, does this really need to be a meeting? Because often people, but also partially if it doesn't, that means maybe the work can be done asynchronous and maybe the meeting time is actually social time, right? So there's ways that even thinking about embracing remote work best practices and sort of moving to more remote first ways of behaving can actually create more space for those belonging activities, right? So the best remote teams barely ever have to meet because they are so good at working with each other. So when they do meet, it can be focused more on those sort of human aspects of it. So that's something I would encourage as well, is people to not think about the belonging and like remote work as separate things, but actually that excellence in both areas is achieved together.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it. One of the things that I think is really probably a great resource for you all at CultureAmp is that you're gathering data from thousands of companies. And so whether it be in the belonging front or the equitable design front, are there trends you've seen over the last year, especially as companies have made this shift around, hey, these are some of the really big opportunities, or these are some things that, companies have focused on clearly, doing this has moved the needle. Anything notable that you'd love to
I
share?
think I think it's really the little things. I also think what's interesting right now is the intersection of that remote work and the anti-racism sort of focus that many companies have professed to have. And I say professed to have because I'm not convinced that most of them actually did anything substantive. But I do think that there is something to be said there for, I don't think there is one best practice. Everyone is looking for like the BuzzFeed article, the 5 things you can do. And I think that's actually pretty reductive. And it gives people this sense that like you don't have to work that hard to create this. So I want to like disabuse anyone of that notion, which is that this is hard. Creating belonging is an incredibly hard thing to do, and it requires a lot of dedicated resources and intention. But if there were things that I would see at first, have someone whose job it is to look after this and resource them appropriately, right? So I think oftentimes we lean on, say, ERGs to do work that they're not investing in otherwise to create that community. I think that's a part of it that we need to think about. Also, making sure that you have someone who's formally responsible for that. I also would say this is not a silver bullet, but it is important. You must be collecting data. So I'm at CultureAmp, and, I'm not here to do a product promo, but I was a customer before I was an employee. And there's a reason I chased Didier, my now boss, the CEO, down. I even wrote him a probability model for why he should hire me. And it was very ridiculous. I also walked in, told him that I wanted this specific job, but that I would not take the job title as spec. And
So funny.
looking back, I'm like, yeah, great career move, Blanche. But it worked out. Like I actually convinced him that it should be equitable design and not D&I. But that's it, is I would say you need to be measuring. And CultureAmp, I will just say, I think it is the best tool for this. It's the reason that I came to work here. But you need to be measuring belonging. You need to be looking at how it's changing over time. And that often will tell you who is experiencing a lack of belonging is a good indicator of what you need to focus on. You can just ask them.
Exactly. Yeah. Drivers are similar across organizations, but every organization's different. It doesn't feel like there's this one recipe. And so I think both being able to gather the data, but also showing your employees that this is something that you value. I mean, you look at business metrics, you can't improve what you can't measure. So very similarly, the health and the safety of those in your organization is something that you should be talking about and opening up conversations about and seeing how that's evolving over time, especially because when you grow really quickly, like what's working today may break tomorrow. I mean, even in business operations, we see that. And so it's important to continue to keep your finger on the pulse. You talked a lot about how this work there's no 5-bullet BuzzFeed article that we can all read and internalize and then master. There's a lot of work that goes into this. And so, I've also seen this notion over the past year around diversity fatigue. And what's your take on that? What's the difference between that and fragility? And how do people teams pace enablement to bring people together versus inadvertently pushing the brakes and creating this overload?
That's such a good question. So I've gotten feedback. So the word for diversity fatigue, I think it was in like the end of 2017. The first time I ever saw it used was in a New Yorker article. And then in the 2018 State of Diversity report, which I fielded out at Atlassian, we sort of found the quantitative evidence that diversity fatigue was real. And how we were defining that was as people disengaging. So from 2017 to 2018, we saw a change in drop sometimes more than 50% in inclusion creating behaviors. And a lot of people don't love the idea of diversity fatigue because they give it so much power. But I think that fragility can be a part of diversity fatigue. But I think more it's that, quite frankly, we spend so much time in this work telling people what not to do. We don't spend enough time filling in the gap and saying, do this instead. And so I think for people from majority groups, we're kind of sick of talking about this topic, which is a harmful idea. And that's definitely the fragility. But it's also, I think I'm doing the things, you just keep telling me not to do things, and I don't know what else to do. And that becomes an exhausting thing. And so people check out from the discussion. I think there's also another side of diversity fatigue, which I think I want a different name for it, but I don't know what it is. But it's like the just damn exhaustion that underrepresented people feel about being consistently gaslighted by their organizations. Like, it's so exhausting to me when I see another company and says, we're dedicating $300 million to diversity, and all of it is external. None of it is actually looking at cultural transformation. And so I think I always say the solution to diversity fatigue is equitable design. Not that it fixes everything, but equitable design is all about making practical, realistic, and consistent changes to the way that we're working. And it goes back to the question you asked about, the wrong metric is, I think company level statistics are important to track, but overall, you're much better off tracking and thinking about the unit of the team. Because diversity fatigue, think about a middle manager. A middle manager is constantly being told, you need to empower more women. And that's wrong, first of all, because women are already powerful as hell, right? What you actually need to be doing is creating space for their power to manifest in amazing ways in that organization. But also, the average middle manager, when you say empower women, they go, what do I do? Buy Dove deodorant? Right? Like, that's not empower women is not a set of instructions. It's not helpful to the person. So even if that intention is in the right place, it isn't always. But even in the case when it is, the managers are not being empowered correctly. And I'll call it again, and I promise I will stop repping my boss. But it's the reason why with CultureAmp, we talk about it being an action platform. So you're able to go and actually not just see the patterns in your data, but you're also able to choose from our inspiration engine, which is ideas from us, from our customer community, about things that they've done to push DEI forward together. And so that's what I would say to advocates of diversity who want to push it forward is be specific and be realistic. And I say that not because I'm speaking from the way the world should be, but I'm speaking for the way the world is, which is, I would call out Atlassian has a great play in their team playbook called Hosting Inclusive Meetings. Go read that play and understand what you should send an agenda in advance. Make sure that everyone knows why they're there. Rotate note taking. If someone is talking too much, make them the facilitator. They don't even sound like DEI things, but they're the types of things that are going to make sure, for example, that the women of color who are constantly ignored or interrupted in meetings are actually able to contribute equitably. So I think that's it for me, is make it actionable, make it achievable, and make it simple. And if you do that, the people with the good intent can start aligning their impact to their intent, and they're not going to get everything right away. What I always say to people, it's not important that you do everything, but it is important that you're always doing something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. No, yeah, exactly. What you've shared is incredibly helpful because it reminds me a lot of management training. When you're enabling managers, good organizations, they have a lot of the resources and then the program. And, this is how you can run an effective one-on-one, not don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, and create this fear. But it's like, these are the tools. This is the how. And then here's a great, tool that we've got, or here's a great process that we've implemented to support you in continuing to drive those behaviors. And it brings it all together. And so a lot of what you're sharing illustrates the exact same thing, in the diversity space.
Absolutely. And I think the thing about it is, I always say that DEI is like a flavor of everything else. It's not actually separate. So what we get into is when we understand, we start thinking about DEI as a what instead of as a how, right? So it's not what we do, it's how we do it. We do it. And this is why I say getting away from D&I and moving towards equitable design, because I think that D&I is an outcome. And when we focus just on the outcome, we find the fastest way to that outcome, not the most effective way to that outcome. And so embracing this idea of equitable design is about embracing a process of consistently creating equity. And you can do that in every layer of your life. So an example from earlier, I had someone reach out to on a different podcast that was specifically for Black and Brown professionals. And, the way that I equitably designed that interaction, I did end up being on the podcast. Hi, Zach at Living Corporate. But I specifically wrote back and I said, I just want to counter that, like, I'm white passing. And so I wanted to make sure that you knew that before you invited me on this podcast that's for Black and Brown professionals, because I'm a very, very light shade of brown if I am brown. And he said, no, I asked you on purpose. I knew that, but thank you for checking. And so that was the example of an equitable design moment. But an equitable design moment could also be a chief sales officer who says, have pay equity audits been done in my department? I'm not willing to move forward with compensation decisions without that, right? So I think what I'm getting at is the idea that we all have the ability to build equitable design into every action that we take every day. And we don't have to do every action, but imagine if every single one of us, one time per day, intentionally made one thing more equitable, how fast would the whole company change? Like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And if there's one thing we've learned, I mean, there's so much that we autopilot, unfortunately, in ways that are so destructive. And so I think these are fail safes for us. They highlight issues that we may not have organically discovered ourselves. And they also, when you have, I think, to your equitable design idea, your CRO, your sales line manager, your entry level sales rep that's brought in the organization, they're all kind of going about it in a very similar way. And so that enables that type of decision making and that type of process to scale with you. And so you avoid the situation where you have, 15 people in the org that are really driving this and are unable to move the needle after a certain point because they are a smaller group within a larger org.
Yeah. And so, I think that's everyone, like people always say, they say it's a cliche, like D&I is everyone's job. But the question is, for me, is not stop saying D&I is everyone's job and asking, but how many people are doing their jobs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I've also heard, like, if you know now what you didn't know before, like, what are you going to do about it? What are you doing about it? So
absolutely. I love that. I think there's power in what you said because it doesn't come with judgment. It comes with responsibility, which is more compelling.
Yeah, 100%. You raised a concept that I think is really interesting around your own identity. And just in that example of you kind of questioning, am I the right person to speak in this podcast? Am I the right person to share my thoughts in this forum? So how do you balance driving a lot of these conversations around diversity, equity, and belonging yourself while also giving underrepresented employees a voice? Like, where's the fine line between that and placing the burden of education on those employees? Because I think a lot of executive leaders also kind of are navigating that challenge that, don't come from underrepresented backgrounds.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really, really hard distinction. And I live in the intersection. So I joke to people, I'm invisibly disabled. So I have bipolar. I'm on the bisexual spectrum. I'm biracial and bicultural. And so, first of all, that's a lot of math. Um, but actually, it gives me the ability. I have the luck of having walked in a lot of different shoes by virtue of being at so many intersections. And so I think for me, it's partially like I try to exist. I quoted this earlier today, but Audrey Lorde had the quote about like everyone must find their work and do it. And I think that's it. So I try to find where I can make a unique contribution to equity and then stick with that. So in terms of providing education, that's a place where I step in big, especially with our leadership team. So I was lucky enough it was a 5-month program that we committed to as a part of sort of our anti-racism plan. So you'll see back in June 2020, we released our anti-racism plan. So we certainly had a commitment because everyone had a commitment and we had to say something. But we decided that making a commitment was too performative for us. And so what we chose to do was to publish an anti-racism plan in which anyone who's watching the podcast can check out at cultureamp.com/anti-racism. And what you'll also see there is not only the plan and the commitment we made, but also it's publishing next week from now. So I think it will be out by the time the podcast is out. But it'll be our anti-racism accountability report. So where we have a blog that's going to go through, did we actually do the programs we committed? What was the results? What were the successes? Where are we still missing? Where are there gaps? But that was really intentional on our part. And what I'm really excited to say is what we found is that our Black employees are now more engaged on average and experience belonging at a higher level on average than some of our other groups, which means, right, we have to evolve the focus. I think the big frontier right now is really around supporting Asian employees, knowing that there's so much stigma, especially around East and Southeast Asian people, anti-Asian violence and things like that. So for our racism focus for this part of the year, we're also bringing our Asian employees into the priority, sort of as a focus population, because we know that they are carrying a lot of weight right now that many of the rest of us are not.
Yeah, I think you've brought up 2 points there that really resonate. One being, a lot of it comes down to vulnerability. There's a big difference between organizations sharing out, hey, we're doing, all this great stuff, and these are our marketing materials, like look at our culture. And then a difference between, what you're sharing, which is here are some of the things that we've learned. This is where we moved the needle. These are some of the gaps that we discovered. Here's what we're doing about it. I think that being part of that learning journey encourages a lot of organizations to openly share, what their gaps and opportunities are. And that's a lot more valuable than just, a big rah-rah. The other thing is specifically to your point around focusing on, Asian Americans and the Asian population is a lot of this work is very tied to what's happening in the outside world. Like it's not in a vacuum. And so that, inherently makes it very complex and something that you really have to just constantly keep pulse on and evaluate, because there's no formula and you're like, okay, cool, we got it right now. And, let's just keep on doing all of these things. It's very tied to what's going on in the outside world, which is, interesting. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
I think that, so I'm really inspired by how Nicole Sanchez thinks about this. So she is the CEO of Via Consulting. She's also been doing DEI work in tech, not longer than I've been alive, but a really long time. Let's be real. They call her the OG tech diversifier, but she's just seen so many cycles of this. And so I find her wisdom to always be really enlightening. But she talks about why she works with organizations, and it's really because she believes that that's where we're going to be actualizing. That's where the locus and the center of this work is, because it's the place. Work is really the only place and I'm speaking of American society. I work for an Australian company, but I want to speak as an American that it's really the only place in our lives where we're forced to interact across difference, right? So our Facebook timelines are meant to put us in little bubbles with only people like ourselves. Our lives, for the most part, because humans have homophily, we like people like ourselves, we build little bubbles in our lives. And so I think the criticality of doing this at work is more acute than ever. But I think we often don't have the language and the skills to do that because we lack diversity in our out of work lives.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a great point. And that's the benefit of, you have to start these conversations to then bring people together, get them to understand one another, their different backgrounds. And I think the United States is a really interesting and great place to do that because of the diversity that we have internally, but it also requires, of course, a lot of conversation. I'd love to kind of transition and talk a little bit about your role today. You recently kind of transitioned to work closer with the product side of the business. I love seeing the expanded scope that a lot of diversity leaders are having internally. So would love to understand a little bit more about, what your day-to-day looks like, how you're making an impact on both the product and the people end. Like, what is a day in the life of Aubrey?
Well, there isn't really a typical day. I just pulled up my calendar to give you a smart answer. So if I'm looking at my last week, I'll say last Monday. What did I do? I first went to my writing class. I'm working on a book. So I woke up early and did some writing. Then I caught up with an employee in London who's helping me. I'm bringing on a new team member, and she wanted to know more about the process and why I had chosen her to be an interviewer. Then I jumped on a call with our customers to talk through some of their results. And then I hopped on a call with another customer to help them understand how CultureAmp could help them out with their work. And then I connected with a teammate who's working with me on sales enablement for our DEI products. So I'm making sure that each of our people on the sales side are communicating the right message to our customers about the power of our platform. Then I jumped into a people team meeting where we talked about programs and our growth check-in, which is our biannual sort of development event that all of our go through. And then I went to the people and experience leadership meeting where we talked about and finalized the strategy and metrics and roadmap for our team this year. And then I ducked out a little early from that meeting to attend a product platform meeting to talk about different equity metrics that we're looking about bringing into the product. So it's a smorgasbord. It's, a bit of a medley of everything. And that for me, I don't have a day that's similar to another day. I love new things. So kind of getting to keep my fingers a little bit of everything is great. But the big thing that change has brought is that I'm doing less and nudging more. So my job, because I span across such a wide expanse, is really to know sort of the high level strategy for this work. But then, my assistant, my little pupper, just needed to come up to get a pat. But really, I get to nudge everything in the direction of a little more equity. And that goes kind of back to what I was thinking about equitable design, where it's like, how do you nudge people to be just a little bit more aligned with their intention than they were before?
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible the impact that you're able to have when you're touching each corner of the business. I imagine it must be very complex to constantly be switching gears, but especially at a company like CultureAmp, where your mission is to support other companies in this work, your expertise is so valuable. So for other diversity and equity belonging leaders, much like yourself, what's your advice to them on how they can start familiarizing themselves more with product strategy? Because it does feel like this role is starting to become even more integrated with the business and external facing work than in years past, where it was just more about those old metrics that, we have now since then realized, okay, there's a lot more impact that we can have when we invest in this function. So how has that learning curve been for you? And what would you advise other DEP leaders to work on
Yeah,
there?
it's definitely been a blur. I always feel I'm constantly getting pushed into beginner's mind, which is good for me and humbling. But first, I really started by just reading the docs. So going in and looking what product strategy documents are there, what are they focused on, what are they thinking about, and trying to get in that. The next was I have a monthly catch up with our chief product officer, Rod. So he and I would talk about, he'd come to me to talk about, personnel issues, which is a silly thing to say, but when he has people things going on, part of that was me coaching him on, how do we do this? And then the other half of it was him coaching me on how would we think about this as a product. So even before I was in the formal role, I was making time to try to get up to speed on what was going on, because part of making the case to Didier, who's CultureAmp CEO and my boss, making the case for the expanded scope was having a strong point of view on how I could support the organization if my scope was advanced. And so that came from jumping on customer calls, even though it wasn't technically my job, to jumping on sales calls, to seeing the way that customers were asking for this and what the most core problems are. And so I really went out and I took the initiative to educate myself about what was possibly needed. So when I came, I didn't just magically get my scope expanded, but rather over the last 6 months, I made it clear to my boss, this is what I want to do. What would you need to see from me in order to say yes? What do you need to get to yes? And he was open with me about that. And he says, you don't have this X or Y skill. And I said, well, how can I beef up my skill set so that you want to say hell yes the next time I bring you a proposal? And so I think that's part of it, is asking the first time. I rarely get a yes the first time I ask. I'm in the middle of I'm scheduled to have a meeting with my boss tomorrow with Didier to talk about an issue that I've been bringing up for a year. And every time we've had the conversation, we've touched on it, we've gotten a little deeper. But so that's the other thing I would say is, if at first you hear not yet, try and keep trying. Because sometimes it's about chipping away at that I'm not sure to get to a hell yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think at great organizations such as CultureAmp, that's really where that empowerment is. You've, raised this interest and now you're getting involved and you're able to make an impact. And so I think it's great that you're able to do that. So one of my last questions for you is really just on the future of diversity and equity and belonging work and what that looks like. You've talked a little bit about the role that equitable design plays in the future of work, but If you're looking at the horizon and you're like, in 5-10 years, this is something that I want to see a lot of companies move the needle on, like what's next?
Black women in leadership.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, like, not that representation doesn't always mean that things get, greater diversity does not always equal more inclusion. But I also just fundamentally believe that our organizations will function better if more women of color are in positions of leadership. And the reason is because what I find is that women of color have more empathy, not because they're like magically wired to have more of it, but because in order to survive and thrive in the world as it's built, they've had to develop empathy for a broader set of experiences than their majority group counterparts have. I want to see organizations being run by openly disabled people. It's the reason that I'm very open about the fact that I'm on the bipolar spectrum, because I want to normalize being disabled at work. I want to normalize being Latina at work and being in a position of power and influence and authority. And so what I would say, I hope the future of work is one in which allies to any cause think about stepping aside when they need to, speaking up when they need to, because the future of work is about belonging. The future of work is about connection and multiculturalism. And so people say, what is DEI in the future of work? I'm like, no, that's the whole future. If we want the best world, if we want to live in a world where everyone is thriving, that is table stakes for the future.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's incredibly well said. I've learned so much from you today. Before we wrap, I'd love to learn if there are other books that you would recommend or other individuals out there in the space that, podcast listeners can, learn more about. And yeah, anyone you'd recommend or any books?
I'll talk about, there's some people that really inspire me. So I mentioned Nicole Sanchez earlier. I think everyone should listen to what she has to say. Michelle Kim, who's the CEO of Awaken. She has a new book coming out also that you should pre-order when that happens. But Michelle Kim is one of the voices I trust the most, coming from an Asian perspective. She's Korean in particular, but the way that she explains concepts and the care and compassion in which she works, I think is absolutely something that I learn from every day. Yvonne Hutchinson, who's the CEO of The Ready Set, is a total badass. I would listen to her opinions on the telephone book, but you should listen to her opinions about everything. So those are 3 women that are, intersectionally marginalized that I think are just brilliant and I learn so much from. So if you follow them, I'm confident that you'll learn a lot too.
Oh, great recommendations. And I'll also say CultureAmp, for those that are listening, I've used it at many companies in the past, and I think it's an incredibly beneficial tool, both because I think it's set up really well to guide a new people team and like what exactly you can be asking your employees, but also I think the ability to slice and dice your data and really understand what's going on in each corner of your organization, that's incredibly insightful. And I think that, is value for any organization that is thinking about, okay, where can I start and what topics can I open up for conversation and how can I see what my work is doing for the organization. So you've kind of talked a little bit about where people can find more information, but cultureamp.com essentially.
Yes. CultureAmp.com if you're interested in products. If you're interested in our anti-racism work, that's just cultureamp.com/anti-racism. And if you want to hear me yell on my digital soapbox, I'm at AD Blanche on just about every platform.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Aubrey, again for the time. The work that you do is so inspiring and always learn something from you. So really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, especially you have so many great voices here. So I'm really honored to be included. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe for the weekly drop and feel free to share around with your people and talent colleagues. I'd love your feedback, so please leave a review and let us know what you enjoyed and what types of topics you'd like to see covered in the future. The more reviews and subscribers we get, the more quality content we can consistently deliver to you. If you're interested in being on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me at russica@engageandempower.org. See you next week.